Okay, opening up the show, that's the Fixing to Die Rag by Country Joe McDonald, live from Woodstock, 1969. Now, why did I choose that song? Well, I choose that song because this topic, lesson number 10, is about student protest, the student movement in Britain, but with larger global connections to geopolitics, what's going on in the United States and what's going on way down yonder in Vietnam.
So, the story of the student protest movement, the student movement, is as we see the rise of the 1960s culture, making rebellion cool, questioning authority cool, challenging new ideas, particularly those of the older generation, we see people pushing for peace, for love, and liberalism. And while this is a massive noise and there's all these protests pushing for changes, be it war, be it around social justice, be it around nuclear bombs, in reality, the only real people who go on these protests are middle-class students and a couple of other hangers-on. And actually, although the student protests have a lot of noise and people know about CND nowadays and there's a lot of talk about the Vietnam War movement, in reality, they make very little difference and only represent a small part of the population.
So in many ways, you can look at the student protest and the student protest movement as sort of a microcosm of the swinging 60s themselves, something that takes place in a tiny group, but largely, though maybe other people are sympathetic, don't get involved. Now, so many of the topics we've talked about are interconnected, and this is just yet another one of them. Of course, media is a tremendous change of the 1960s. If we think back to, 5, 6 lessons ago when we looked at media specifically, you see that in the 1960s, the birth of the television and increasing media really changes things. They create, as part of the new media of the 1960s, the idea of youth, the teenager, and a youth market. The idea of rebellion and being different and, being different than the generation before is a strong theme of this, the youth of the 1960s. This is not only the case in America, it's the case in Britain. Now we have here the famous James Dean Rebel Without a Cause, one of the first big movies to launch the sort of idea of the youth culture. James Dean, you can see him there, dressed like a rocker. He really sort of he is the epitome of the rocker rebellious image.
Just look at that collar. It's popped up. Collars are meant to be down. He is a rebel without a collar.
As said for my conservative friend here to the left, who's never popped a collar in his day, nor should he. Above him, actually, in a different note, is we have John Lennon and his wife Yoko Ono. This is taken from the Bed-In for Peace, which took place in 1972. Another interesting tidbit and extraordinarily relevant to your lives is the fact that this took place in Montreal, Canada, home of yours truly. So, in many ways, the most important factoid you'll learn in this course. Nevertheless, all this means is that many people in the media, many famous people, push young people and give them a sense that they need to be part of a generation that wants liberal values, that rebel against the conservative societies in which they live in. And the same is the case for America, as is the case for Britain. And, well, as John and Yoko prove, Canada too can play.
Didn't achieve much, though, did it? Really?
The bed-in for peace?
Yeah. I mean, well, I mean, like, you know, like most things that was emerged from Canada, like, it largely was irrelevant and actually didn't really matter because the war continued.
Well, I will say, in defense of my countrymen, the Fairmont Hotel in downtown Montreal has a suite which you can stay in called the Bed In for Peace suite, which you can actually sleep in the bed where John and Yoko have done. So, in any ways,
so they make money off that, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. It actually improved the economy of the country dramatically.
See, Montreal became a tourist destination.
Yeah, we were able to buy a new boat. Okay, in all seriousness, we got the change in the 1960s, subcultures and rebellion.
So, as part of this youth subculture, and as part of youth being sold the dream that they are different and that they are special, we see the rise of rebellion. And in particular, the idea of being a youth, a member of the youth, as it were, a student, became shifted from obeying your parents to being a rebel, challenging the traditional attitudes towards marriage, drugs, authority, and the meaning of life. Gone are the days where you are expected to go to university, marry at 22, and become a functional conservative member of middle-class society. Now you need to experiment with drugs, experiment with rebellion, experiments with free love or casual sex. All these things are going against the norms, and it's not an accident that we see a rise in this period of political activism against authority and against the government in particular. And so what happens is individuals who are against the standard of attitude towards marriage, sex, authority, drugs, then find themselves also going, hang on, I also don't like the government's view on this, because the government represents rich, old, white men. If you're not one of those, or you do not like them, then you'll find yourself in political opposition to them, and that's what we find out from there.
Now, unsurprisingly, you'll not, I suppose, well, unsurprisingly, a lot of this takes place in the universities in the 1960s and 70s, as referenced in earlier lessons. Again, there is a large increase in university attendance, particularly amongst the middle class. Not only is that a factor of more affluence among the middle class so they can afford to universities, it also is a factor of the government is pumping money into the construction of new universities, and there are more university places available. So there's sort of a double whammy, if you will, where we have a large group of people who perhaps wouldn't have attended university in the past are now attending universities in the 1960s. And of course, these universities become sort of bastions of liberalism, and the students who attend, the people most affected by the media and popular culture, the middle class, effectively radicalize each other. And it becomes cool to be rebellious. It becomes cool to get involved. It becomes cool to sort of go against the norms. Universities, of course, will within themselves have the structures to organize protest and will be the leading proponents of government policies. And professors as well as students will become highly, highly involved in this movement.
So, one of the first big movements, and you would have seen this logo in many places, if you're not quite sure what it represented, was the CND. This was a campaign for nuclear disarmament. And it's unsurprising that people who preach free love, peace, environmentalism will be against nuclear bombs. Nuclear bombs destroy the environment, yes, but more than that, kill hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of civilians. And as such, there is the movement to disarm Britain's nuclear bombs and then also push for world disarmament gathers pace in the 1960s. And so it's trying to actively avoid nuclear apocalypse by getting rid of nuclear bombs. The argument being, even if there was a nuclear war between Britain and America, America and Russia, no one would bother to bomb Britain because it can't find nuclear bombs back, so why would they bother? Slightly naive belief, perhaps, but that's what they believed. And what we find is a lot of people want to be part of this. It mobilizes a lot of left-wing support and student support, and a lot of people end up supporting the CND. Some very famous actions, such as, for example, the March to Aldermaston, which is a nuclear research facility, was a particular rallying point, and it inspires loads of other marches with up to 150,000 people joining into various marches, which gets a lot of media attention. And the CND marches are in general very well ordered, very polite. There's no real violence. Occasionally there'll be people trying to storm various nuclear establishments, but there's never really a massive issue. And despite all of this, and despite the fact it did generate a lot of support, this is primarily a middle-class, young person organisation, with between 40 to 50% of all members being middle-class students under 21. And actually what it results in, very little at all. There's no real change to government policy. Government policy is official government policy is we need the nuclear bomb to stay relevant. The nuclear bomb is important to defend ourselves. We are not going to listen to you. And it doesn't really cause any real significant change at all. And by the time of the Vietnam War, from 1965 onwards, people start forgetting about C&D and focusing on the Vietnam War, which is a far more hot topic.
I guess 2 points to add on that. Number one, most Britons don't support the C&D. Most Britons have the sort of general viewpoint that if the world were to be involved in a nuclear contact, Britain needs the ability, or conflict, Britain needs the ability to strike first, eliminate its enemies, therefore avoid the potential of being destroyed by nuclear bombs if they remain passive and outside of the nuclear game and not actually owning any. That's point one. Most general Britons support the use and possession of nuclear weapons. Point number two is the CND and the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament gets attached to left-wing political groups, and for those of you who are relatively politically astute that paid attention to the news in the last year, you will have noted that a large platform of the SNP, the Scottish National Party, which is a left-leaning, very social democratic party, maybe even to some ways, to a degree less than that, they had a huge part of their independence platform based around the fact that they do not want British nuclear weapons, or they don't want English nuclear weapons, because far be it from the northern, those lovely Northern Irish wouldn't want nuclear weapons either. But anyways, I digress. The English nuclear weapons out of Scottish territory, the Scottish bases near Glasgow is where the British nuclear submarines were held. Anyways, this does have some sort of permanence in that regard. The major real war protests that actually caused a lot of turmoil in the country are the anti-Vietnam War protests. Again, Britain does not get involved in Vietnam. No British soldiers actually take part in combat missions in Vietnam. It's primarily an American affair. However, the British government publicly and through the supplying of arms and aid supports the American intervention in Vietnam. This leads a lot of people, especially those in 1968, who see that the British government is a left-leaning liberal government, that one that they believe fundamentally shouldn't be aligned with the United States in what they consider a sort of colonist war, an aggressive imperialist war against the Vietnamese, and therefore an anti-Vietnam war protest really starts to gain a lot of traction in the UK. Of course, universities is where the anti-Vietnam War protest really kicks off. The most prominent anti-Vietnam war group was at the London School of Economics, very, very well known for its School of International Relations, and within those schools at LSE, the anti-Vietnam War protest really, really finds an organizational fulcrum, if you will. This comes to a head with violent protests at the American Embassy in Grosvenor Square. At a point, it was believed that students would actually occupy the embassy. They did not. Nevertheless, the violence in their attempts to occupy the embassy were televised by the media, and this really shook Britons who were I guess, naively thinking that the events in Vietnam weren't affecting them, but it really brought the war and the anti-Vietnam War sentiment that was prevalent in America, expressed in the song by Country Joe McDonald at Woodstock in 1969, but also come across and are felt here in the United Kingdom in 1968. The real peak, of course, is the year of 1968. It's a real peak of, well, the summer of love. It's a real peak of the hippie movement. It's a real peak of the the 1960s, whereby afterwards the movement starts to die out for a number of different reasons. But 1968 is a year of activism across the board: anti-Vietnam, civil rights, anti-Vietnam in the United States, nuclear disarmament, and so on and so forth. But in Europe as well, there are also large protests, most notably in Paris, where students effectively occupy the universities and occupy the streets around them.
And definitely as part of that the Grosvenor Square protest, which Mr Raine alluded to before, is a key turning point. In reality, most students' activism about the Vietnam War was harassing Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister at the time, and to a lesser extent Edward Heath afterwards, and harassing them for change. And in reality, didn't really capture them public imagination. Occasionally we recorded that people were shouting at the Prime Minister. We have a couple of times we have paint for the Prime Minister about it. And by and large, it doesn't really make a difference in the public consciousness. Most people are just not aware that there is a massive protest movement amongst universities beyond these sort of single moments. The Grosvenor Square protest, which is widely reported on the BBC, a picture of it is at the bottom of the picture we also had at the start of today's session. Both shocked average Britons, and although this therefore spread the anti-Vietnam War message, it didn't really do it many favours. You don't really see this and think Vietnam War is a good thing. If anything, the sort of tone of the reporting was very much on the side of the police rather than that of the students. So the anti-Vietnam War protest, although it's noisy, doesn't actually get very much done at all. So, if we a nice and short one, Danielle Blake will be very, very happy with this. This cannot be separated from the fact that rebellion was cool, and which inspired many protesters. The fact that people are joining, yes, because they don't like the ideas, they're joining it in part because rebellion is quite cool. And in reality, you should never avoid the focus on the fact that yes, they are noisy, yes, they campaign against CND, they occupy universities, they campaign against Vietnam War, but it doesn't really do anything. It doesn't change anything because it doesn't actually motivate the vast majority of people to actually take their side. And the problem is, Britain is a democracy. And therefore, you need to get enough people on your side so that people who want votes have to sort of agree with you. And they only represent 5%, maybe 10%, if you're really, really, really exaggerating, of the population. And the rest were indifferent or hostile to these actions. And this is the same even amongst young people. It's only the middle class left-wingers who are really anti-Vietnam, very pro-CND, and anti-authority. Most, even if they enjoy the youth culture, don't really get involved. And the student movement largely comes to an end with the end of the Vietnam War, or the end of the US involvement in Vietnam War in 1973. After 1973, there's nothing really to rebel against. And so what ends up happening is people get involved in drugs, people get involved in music, and this rebellion, that feeling from rebellion, that gut feeling that we need to go and do something, dissipates, and people just end up focusing on their own thing and trying to be cool instead.
So that brings us to the end of our lesson on student movement and student protest. A relatively short lesson by comparison, but one where effectively, if we could sum up in one, small group of people making a lot of noise, getting a disproportionate amount of attention, who make little progress. With one little tidbit that brings us back home to the motherland, Canada. In his bed in Montreal in 1972, a linen-clad John Lennon and a linen-clad Yoko Ono grabbed their guitars and in front of the world's media said, "Give peace a chance. Have a nice night."
Such an idiot.
Give peace a chance. These are easy lyrics. I could have written these myself.
I can't even make them out myself.
All we are saying is give peace a chance.
Oh, okay.
It's not that hard. You have a degree from Oxford.
Scholarship, darling, scholarship.
They give those out too easily these days, that's all I can say.
Needs to be some of the scum to make all the numbers.
Taking me back to Montreal.
You would have been 24 when this was... Remember that far back?
You're a terrible person.